Endgames with Rook and Bishop against Rook and Knight by David Hooper. You may wonder why I've chosen to discuss this particular endgame. Well, it's one that is not given much space in endgame books, yet it occurs quite often. There were several such endgames in the 1978 World Championship match, for example. I shall be giving mostly games by world champions, especially by Lasker. In his games, this is the most common kind of endgame, one which he specially liked. He was one of the first players who regarded the endgame not merely as the phase in which one might capitalize on a middle game advantage, or seeks to save a disadvantageous position, but as a phase in which it is as legitimate to strive for a win as in an earlier phase. For this purpose, an endgame with two pieces each offers better chances than when each player has only one piece. The greater possibilities of maneuvering to outwit your opponent. I shall be discussing the various ideas as we go through the examples. First, we shall examine some positions that favor the bishop. I shall use two technical terms for the center. The basic center, which means the four squares in the middle of the board, and the central zone, which means the 16 squares in the middle of the board. Generally, the bishop is the better piece to have if it is not obstructed by one of its own pawns in the basic center, and if play takes place over a wide front. By wide front, we mean there are pawns extending across the board, 7 or 8 files perhaps. The knight is a short-hopping piece, and the bishop can show its superiority only if it can maneuver at long range. If, for example, the pawns were spread across, say, 5 files, then the long range of the bishop is at a discount. It may not matter at all that it can control squares on the other 3. Given these conditions, a wide front and open diagonals, the bishop is an even more effective piece if there are pawn majorities or passed pawns. It can support the advance of its own pawns on one side of the board and at the same time defend on the other side. In such cases, the bishop is an excellent defender because it can act from a distance, whereas the knight is usually a poor defender. As soon as it moves, it no longer defends the squares it previously commanded. You will find all the positions we are discussing in the booklet. Please set up position 1 and study it for a few minutes by yourself. It is black's move, and this was the 13th World Championship game between Lasker White and Steinitz in 1894. Black to move plays 1 pawn to f4. A rather unusual move since it puts the pawn on a dark square, the same color as the bishop. It also seems to give white a potential outpost at e4 for his knight. The move was played, however, to fix the white pawns on the king's side, since they might otherwise have been expanded, white advancing his knight's pawn. Furthermore, the white knight cannot easily get to e4, since nd2 runs into a pin by rd8, nor can the knight come round to g4 by way of h2. Black's pawn at can be played to h5 to stop that. Finally, white's rook cannot leave the back rank. Suppose it goes to d5. Then another point of black's move reveals itself. The black rook moves to e8, threatening to come to e1, when white's king will be in trouble. While white is tied down on the king's side, black has freedom on the queen's side. He can bring his king up and advance his queen's side pawns, and eventually make a passed pawn. After black has played pawn to f4 in diagram 1, white moved king to h2, probably hoping to get a little freedom by moving up his h-pawn and bringing the king further forward. Black then brought his rook to the open e-file by playing rook to e8. At present, he is not threatening to advance the rook, because white could, say to the 7th, because white could then activate his knight by knight to d2. After rook to e8, white played pawn to a4, black moved king to c7, white played pawn to h4 and black king to c6. As black is now threatening to obtain a passed pawn, white played pawn to c4. How would you now play as black? Switch off here and study the position. Black's next move was the powerful bishop to b4, planning to move his king up, and you'll note, since this endgame has begun, that neither the white rook or knight has been moved at all. White played king to h3. Now again stop the cassette and decide upon a move for black. Though he had other moves at his disposal, such as king up or pawn to h5, black decided to exchange rooks with rook to e1. White had to capture, rook takes e1, then black played bishop takes e1, and established this way a winning position. White resigned the game 19 moves later, and you can find the remaining moves in the booklet. Generally, in endings of this type, with open center files and with wing majorities, the player with the bishop enhances his advantage by exchanging rooks, a ploy to bear in mind. Now set up position 2. Study it for a little time before listening to the commentary. This is the second World Championship game between Alekhine, white, and Erva in 1937. It is another example of an active bishop against a knight, though in this case the defending side is not completely paralyzed as in the previous example. There are majorities on both wings, and at first sight black appears to have some chances of creating a passed pawn on the queen's side. But white's bishop and his pawn at a4 prevent this at the moment, and if black were to try advancing pawn to a6, white could answer pawn to a5, blocking this wing. White to move plays pawn to h4. Black replies king to d7 to control e7. White plays king to f2 and black knight to e7. It seems black is going to be able to get an outpost for his knight at d5. And what is more, this would attack white's pawn at c3. So how do you now play as white? Turn off the cassette here. White answered black's threat by ignoring it and playing king to f3. This piece threatens to invade the king side by way of g4 and h5. Black answered knight to d5, and white played sharply at this point bishop to d3. He doesn't mind losing both his queenside pawns as long as he gets a passed h-pawn in return, for he expects to be able to advance his pawns more quickly. This is what should happen if black were to capture on c3. Black, knight takes c3, white, bishop takes h7, black, knight takes a4, white, bishop to f5 check, black, king to c7, white, pawn to h5, black, rook to d8, white, pawn to h6, and white is going to win a rook for this pawn. So, return to diagram 2a. Black decided now to defend his h-pawn and played pawn to h6. White increased the pressure with bishop to f5 check. Black played king to d8. Now it is white's move. Switch off and consider how you would now play. The move pawn to c4 seems to have a lot to be said for it, but Alekhine played more forcefully king to g4. However, probably only now, realizing the true extent of his difficulties, reluctantly brought his knight back to e7. White played bishop to b1, and black played king to e8. In this way, black tries to cross the barrier set up by white's rook stationed at e1, the barrier on the king's file, to bring his king to confront the passed, or rather to confront the pawn majority. But it's already too late. White plays king to h5, black king to f7. Black hopes for counterplay if white captures on h6 straight away by discovering check, moving his pawn to f5. Instead, Alekhine played bishop to a2 check. Black played king to f8, and now white played king to h6. King takes the pawn on h6, and the win is easy. Black, rook to d2, white, bishop to e6, black, rook to d3, white, pawn to g4, black, rook takes c3, white, pawn to g5, and black resigned. His queenside pawns have yet to move, but whites are galloping down to the 8th rank. You may well be asking, if this is what happens when you have a bishop, what of the poor man who has a knight? Later we shall be showing the knight's paces. But we might add that even with a wide front and a free-ranging bishop, the knight will give drawing chances if it can be established on a strong square in the central zone, especially such a square where it cannot be attacked by a bishop. Now please look at diagram 2 again, and suppose that white, on his first move, advances a pawn to f5. Black replies knight to e5, and the endgame will be drawn. Once the knight can be established on a strong square in the central zone, or better still, in the basic center, it controls its full complement of 8 squares and is the equal of the bishop. Please set up example 3. Have a look at it, and then switch on for the commentary. This is yet another World Championship game, this time between Marshall, who was white, and Lasker in 1907. It was black's move, and realizing that the best square for the bishop cannot yet be determined, he develops his rook instead. Black, rook to b8. White has to play pawn to b3. It still seems that white is going to be able to develop normally, but black extracts another ounce of advantage out of his lead in development. He plays rook to b5. Mark this move well, since it shows that open ranks, in this case the 4th rank, can be just as important as open files. The tactical point of black's 4th move comes out if white plays knight to d2. Then black, rook to c5, attacking white's c-pawn. White, rook to c1, black bishop to a6 check, white king to f2, black bishop to d3, winning the c-pawn. Now return to the diagram 3, and add the moves that we have just played. Black rook to b8, white pawn to b3, black rook to b5. To avoid the line of play we've just seen, Marshall, as white, played pawn to c4. This saves the pawn, but allows black a passed pawn at d4. Black moved rook to h5. White played king to g1, and black pawn to c5. This was the sealed move. During the adjournment, Marshall could see no danger for himself and said, "At worst I can easily draw." Yet, in another half-dozen moves, some of them rather bad, he gets a lost position. Continue. White, knight to d2, black, king to f7. Black crosses this f-file just the right moment, otherwise white would move his rook to f1 and hold the black king in. Instead, white plays rook to f1 with check, and black plays king to e7. Now switch off and study this position for a few minutes. Possibly white might try a plan such as rook to f4, followed by pawn to h4, knight to f3, knight to e1, and knight to d3. And the knight would be well placed at d3, but it would take him too long. Not at all easy plan to carry out. Instead, Marshall actually chose, from the position in diagram 3a, to play pawn to a3, aiming to exchange queenside pawns, but probably overlooking Lasker's fine reply, which was rook to h6. And now Lasker is going to make use of the open third rank. White plays pawn to h4, black rook to a6, and white rook to a1. This rook move of white's is, of course, hopeless. He should have played pawn to a4. This leaves a weakness at b3, but at least his rook is kept on the f-file. Possible penetration should black move his king up. However, after moving the rook to a1, black continued bishop to g4, at last developing this piece. White played king to f2, black played king to e6, white king to g2, black king to e5, white pawn to a4, and black rook to f6. Now black's king is so well placed he does not mind an exchange of rooks. White plays rook to e1, black plays pawn to d3, white rook to f1, black king to d4, white rook takes rook, black pawn takes rook. And white resigned 17 moves later, when he had practically run out of moves to play. In this example, white was not able to get his knight to its correct square at d3. And as a result, it just played a useless role. Please set up position 4 and do some preliminary study of it independently. This position arose from the exchange variation of the Rai Lopez in the first World Championship game between Lasker, who was white, and Tarash in 1908. There is a wide pawn front, there are pawn majorities, and black has a bishop that is not obstructed by one of its own centre pawns. However, it is black who is on the defensive. This is due to his double pawn on the queen's side, which makes it difficult to get a passed pawn there. Meanwhile, white has some prospects of advancing his kingside pawns, which, even in their present situation, cramp the action of the black bishop to some extent. White plays first pawn to c4, very necessary, otherwise black would himself have played a pawn to this square, and his majority would have become active. But now his pawn majority on the queen's side is bottled up. Play takes place, in effect, on a narrow front, the king's side, and this factor favors the knight. Black now moved rook to e8. He should have stopped one square short, and now he loses quite a lot of time regrouping. White plays knight to h5, black rook to g8, white plays rook to d3, black plays pawn to f6, white plays king to d2, black plays bishop to e8. Now white retreats his knight to g3, black plays bishop to d7, white plays king to e3, and black plays rook to e8. Please switch off and have a look at this position. As we can see, white has made some progress in bringing his king to the center, while black has been disentangling himself. White now advanced knight to h5, and black replied rook to e7, and white played pawn to g4. He doesn't really wish to allow black the chance of playing pawn to f5, because each pawn exchange would give the bishop more scope. Black plays pawn to c6, preparing to make something, in certain circumstances should they arise, of his majority. White plays pawn to h4, and black replies king to c7. Turn off the cassette again and study the position once more. This is an important crossroads for white. Should white advance his pawn to g5 straight away, allowing black to reply pawn to f5, or should he play his king up to f4, hoping to play it in more favorable circumstances? In that case, black would try to block white's progress by rook to f7. Then white could move his king back to g3, again threatening pg5. Please return to diagram 4a, however, because this is not the line that Lasker played. In fact, from diagram 4a, he went pawn to g5 straight away. Black naturally replied pawn to f5, seeking to exchange e-pawns. White played knight to g3, and black played pawn takes pawn at k4, e4, and white played knight takes e4. Now stop and have another look at the position. Black to play has a chance to activate his queenside majority by advancing his b-pawn. Later he could bring his king to b6 and his bishop to e6. putting considerable pressure on white's pawns on this side of the board, the queen's wing. This course of action should ensure him a draw, at least. Instead, black played bishop to f5, also a sound move. White pawn to h5, black rook to d7, and white answered rook to c3. This is one of Lasker's tricky moves. An exchange of rooks would only bring the black king closer to the center, and the rook at c3 discourages black from advancing pawn to b5. However, black can now penetrate with his own rook, and he plays rook to d1. When a rook finally goes all, or nearly all the way down a file, we call this a penetration, a useful advance both in defense and attack to get the rook behind the pawns. Play continued. White, king to f4, black, bishop to d7. After this retreat, black doesn't get a look in. He had to exchange on e4, and if white recaptures with the king, move his rook to h1, or if white recaptures with the pawn, bring his king in front of it by playing king to d7. With an active rook against a passive one, he should be able to hold the position. Very probably, Tarash's fondness for the bishops caused this error. After bd7, as in the game, white answered rook to e3. He gets his rook into play, and he makes a barrier on the e-file, so that black will have difficulty getting his king to the king's side. This was much as we saw in example 2. Black moved rook to h1. Now stop the cassette and work out your play as white. White's reply was knight to g3. Black, rook to h4, check. White, king to e5. Black, rook to h3. White, pawn to f4. Black, king to d8. White, pawn to f5. The position is now overwhelming for white, as is quite clear. But if you wish to see how white actually finished his opponent off, you will find the moves in the booklet. Let us move on to position 5. This has a world champion as our partner once again, but it was not a world championship game. White was one of the few English chess players around at the time, H.E. Atkins, and black was Capablanca. The game took place at the London tournament of 1922. Please study the position carefully to show that you are not impatient before listening to the commentaries. It is white's move. I shall pause while you turn off the cassette for a short while. In this position, there are pawn majorities, and there is a wide front. But the state of the white bishop has deteriorated considerably from the previous examples. It is necessary to have only one central pawn blocking a bishop, because there its greatest asset, to move across the board, is nullified. In fact, for the first 43 moves of this game, the bishop has done nothing, and it does nothing for the rest of the game. White's difficulties are compounded by the fact that his pawn at d4 is isolated, and black has already been able to take advantage of this by planting his king at d5. Capablanca continued quite bluntly in this position to create a passed pawn on the queen's side in the following manner. White played first pawn to f3. Black, rook to b8. White, rook to a3. Black, pawn to b5. White, A pawn takes B pawn. Black, rook takes B pawn. White, bishop to F2. Black, knight to B4. Please now switch off the tape and study the position. After black's knight to B4, if white marks time, perhaps playing bishop to E3, black can move knight to D3, attacking the B pawn and also threatening knight to E1. Against knight to D3, white does not have the undermining move pawn to B3 available, as black would capture it with his pawn, and after king takes knight, he would advance the B pawn. If instead of white king takes knight, he plays rook takes pawn at B3, black can exchange rooks. Rook takes rook check, white king takes rook, black knight to E1, white king to A4, black knight takes pawn at G2, and he will soon mop up the king's side pawns while white is busy capturing the A pawn. Return now to diagram 5A. White decided to exchange the B and C pawns while he could and played pawn to B3. Black took this pawn, and white played king takes pawn at B3, and black played knight to C6, discovering check, and white played king to C3. Now switch off and study this position. The first stage of black's plan has been completed. He has created an outside pass pawn, and the condition of white's bishop has not altered. The problem now is to advance the A pawn further. Rook to B4 is the obvious way to do this, but fails disastrously when white replies rook takes pawn at A5 check. Capablanca actually played rook to B1, and now white seemed to act carelessly. He could have tried bishop to E3 in order to answer rook to E1 by king to D2. Instead, he moved forward rook to A4. Black gained ground with rook to C1 check, white king to D2, black rook to C4, white rook to A1, black pawn to A4, white rook to A3, black knight to A7, white rook to A1, black knight to B5, white rook to B1, black king to C6, white king to D3. Stop the tape now and consider your play as black in this position. In order to make progress, Capablanca offered the exchange of rooks, playing rook to C3 check, white king to D2, black rook to B3. If white exchanges rooks then, by rook takes B3, pawn takes B3, we reach an interesting position shown in diagram 5V, which will repay some time spent in independent study. What did you think of this position? Is it a win for black or a draw? You will note that white's king cannot directly approach black's pawn, and king to C1 is no use after black replies king to D5, white plays king to B2, and black plays king to C4. In addition, from the position in diagram 5V, Black is threatening to advance his pawn, taking advantage of a knight fork on the white bishop as follows. Black, pawn to b2, white, king to c2, black, knight to c3. Of course, this piece cannot be captured because the pawn would queen, so white plays king takes b2, and black plays knight to d1 check, picking up the bishop at f2. It follows from this that white's first move in diagram 5b should be bishop to g1 to avoid this nasty trick. And after black plays king to d5, white king to d3, it seems black is stymied. But then he has pawn to g5, and white has hardly a move left. He cannot move his bishop, and if he plays pawn to g3, black can play pawn to b2, white king to c2, knight takes d4, check, white king takes b2, and black plays knight takes f3, winning another pawn. As his king is nearer to the white pawns than black's, he should pick up more pawns on this side, and thus clinch the win. After that long divergence, we shall return to diagram 5b and see how the game went. White did not exchange rooks, but played rook to c1 check, king to b7, and then rook to c2. Black played pawn to a3, leading to diagram 5c. White is threatening to exchange rooks again by rook to b2. And if white exchanges rooks, rook takes b2, pawn takes b2, king to c2. Black plays knight to c3, and again threatens to fork and win the bishop. White must find a square for this bishop, but on g1 it would be chased away when black played rook to b1. These examples of restricted mobility show how disastrous it has been for white to have his pawn at d4. In desperation, Atkins played, from diagram 5c, bishop to g3, letting go of the burdensome pawn, and black captured knight takes d4. White played rook to c7 check, black played king to bishop b6, and white played rook to c4. How would you now continue as black? Switch off here for a few moments and decide. Black's last neat finesse was king to b5, sacrificing the knight to let the pawn go through. Instead, however, white replied rook to c8, black knight to c6, white rook to a8, black rook to b2 check, white king to e3, black rook takes g2, white bishop to f2, and black knight to b4. The knight has the last word. If white captures the a pawn, it forks the rook. Therefore, Atkins here resigned. Please set up position 6. It is black's move, and turn off the cassette while you try to work out what you would play if you were black. This is the end of the 29th World Championship game between Korchnoi White and Karpov in 1978. We saw in the last example that an outside passed pawn and knight could win, but this depends upon the opponent's having a bad bishop. When the bishop runs free, the outside pawn, accompanied by a knight on a broad front is rarely effective. Here the black knight, loitering on the edge of the board, never gets to help his passed pawn. Black labours under several difficulties. His king cannot easily get to the queen's side to defend against white's pawn majority. He cannot easily get his knight into play, and his isolated pawns are also vulnerable. In the game, he does manage to get a counterattack with his rook, which is correct in principle. He has just given check with his rook, and now has to make a choice. Should he defend by moving his rook back to e5, or counterattack by moving his rook to h4? Either move seems to offer drawing prospects. Instead, he plays rook to f4 check, which appears to be a decisive error. It is very consoling to the rest of us, who read in every beginner's book that one should avoid useless checks, to find them being made by a world champion. Play continued, white king to e3. He's one vital step nearer to the queen's side, and black played rook to h4. It was too late anyway to play his rook back to the fourth rank, because white could then advance his king. So white played rook to d5. Black played rook to h3 check. White played king to d2. Black played rook takes b3. And white played rook takes c5, putting the question to black's knight, which cannot reply. If it goes to d6, white rook to c6 pins it. If it goes to a7, white plays b to b6. So black must play his rook back to guard the knight, and he plays rook to b8. White plays rook to c6 check. Black plays king to f5. White plays rook takes a6, and black plays pawn to g4. Black tries to become dangerous with his passed pawn, hoping to hold the queenside pawns with his knight. Switch off here to decide how you would play as white. White continued rook to f6 check. Black king to e4. And white played bishop to c7. Funnily enough, as well as attacking the rook, this move threatens a pure mate at f4 by white's rook. So black has no choice and plays rook to b2 check. And white plays king to c3. Black plays rook to b7. And white plays bishop to g3. Now the g-pawn is blocked, as well as being threatened by loss if black were to check with his rook at f4. And black played rook to b1. How do you continue as white here? White finished off combinatively with rook to f4 check, black king to e3, white rook to f8. This seals black's fate. If the knight goes to a7, white wins it with bf2 check. So black must play knight to e7. White plays pawn to a6, and here Karpov resigned, since if he plays black knight to c6, white will play pawn to a7, and after knight takes a7, he wins this knight by a skewer bishop to f2 check. As white then retains one pawn, he should be able eventually to queen it, and thus to win the game. Please set up position 7. This occurred in a game between Lasker, who was white, and Schippers at Nuremberg, 1896. It is white's move, and you can stop the cassette and study the position for a little while. When there is a wide front, an outside passed pawn, accompanied by a bishop, is usually strong, and often leads to a win. The player with the knight is likely to have only two kinds of counterchance. Either he can push forward a pawn of his own as fast as possible, or he may hope for some tactical plan with the knight. In the last example, we saw the bishop supporting a few rook checks and skewering a piece. But the delight of having a knight is that there are many more tactical possibilities, especially the possibility of a fork, its main weapon, but even on occasion the chance of a mating attack. It is white's move, instead of capturing the h-pawn, which his opponent probably expected, and which could possibly lose, he makes a plan to advance his f-pawn as fast as possible. Fortunately for him, the black king is rather far away for defensive purposes. Even so, the power of black's passed pawn and bishop should have been sufficient to bring about a draw, as will be seen. Play continued, white rook to g5, attacking the bishop, which moved to d3. Now white got his knight out of the way of the f-pawn by playing knight to d7 check. Black played king to c7, and white played knight to e5, gaining a tempo on the bishop, and black played bishop to e4. White advanced pawn to f5. Black here had the problem of deciding how to stop this white pawn from queening. This he solved by black rook to a2, white pawn to f6, black rook to a8, white pawn to f7. At last, white's pawn has reached the 7th, while its opposite number, on b5, has made no progress. Black now brought his king into the defense with black king to d6, and white played rook to g8. Naturally, the knight at e5 is immune, as white is threatening to exchange rooks and queen a pawn. Black defended with king to e7, exploiting the fact that his bishop guards the black rook at a8, and white played kf4, and black replied bishop to d5. Now switch off and study this position for a few minutes. It looks as though white has reached the end of his advance, as black is threatening to exchange rooks and win the pawn on f7 as well. So white has to retreat rook to g7. Yet this move also contains a threat. Rook takes pawn on h7, followed by knight to g6 check. Please switch off again and decide how you would defend the position as black. Well, what did you come up with? Worst move for black seems to be rook to f8, as after white rook takes h7, black bishop takes f7, white plays knight to g6 check, winning the exchange. The bishop, of course, is pinned. If you've moved the pieces, go back to diagram 7a. Black's best move is pawn to b4, hurrying to queen his own pawn. After white rook takes h7, black pawn to b3, white knight to g6 check, black king to d6, white pawn to f8 becomes a queen, black rook takes queen, White knight takes rook. Black pawn to b2. White rook to h1. Black bishop to a2. White king takes f3. Black pawn equals queen. The game will be drawn. There isn't enough material left on the board. If you now return the pieces to diagram 7a again, we'll see what move Schiffers actually chose. Black played rook to h8. This move may be satisfactory, but as we have seen, black could have drawn more easily by advancing his b-pawn. It is curious how often players, burdened by awkward threats, fail to see the counter chances available to them. We've already seen how Tarish failed in example 4. In both cases, by forcing the pace, a draw could have been made more quickly and without laying oneself open to further problems. After black had played rook to h8, white had a curious idea at his disposal. He could queen the pawn, and after black takes this with his king, play his rook to a7. Black is rather hemmed in, and white will now bring his king up to f6 with mating threats. Either Lasker didn't see this possibility, or decided it wasn't decisive. At all events, the way the game went, he used much the same idea. And in answer to rook to h8, which you should now play from diagram 7a, he played king to g5. Black played pawn to h6 check. White played king to f5. Black played bishop to e6 check. And white played king to g6. Here black moved his rook to c8. This is to prevent the knight giving check. Schiffers, white now played rook to h7. And Schiffers was now to learn what many masters were to discover, that any move made by Lasker, however seemingly innocuous, must be examined with circumspection. Black could have drawn now by blocking the f-pawn with his rook, but he may have supposed he was winning, and he played pawn to b4. Switch off and decide upon your continuation as white. White played pawn to f8 equals queen check. Black played king takes queen. White played king to f6, and black played bishop to g8. White played rook to e7, threatening mate in 1, and black played bishop to h7, necessary to stop the mate. White played rook takes h7, and black played king to g8. White played rook g7 check. Black played king to f8. White played rook to b7. And black played rook to a8. Hopes to drive the white king away. White played rook to f7 check. And black played k to e8. And white now mated in 6 moves. See booklet for how this can be done. Quite remarkable, the variety of tactical possibilities open to the knight in such situations. Please set up Position 8. This is from a game played in Russia in 1977. We can now see how, as the front narrows, and here it is only 6 files wide, the knight really comes into its own. White is a pawn up, but black is threatening to win the knight with pawn to d3, uncovering an attack from his bishop. Stop the tape and decide, if you were white, how you would now play. The first move played was not white rook to d3, but pawn to b4 check. White is trying to put his knight at d3, with the idea of keeping his rook behind the passed pawn. After black played king takes b4, white played king to d5, and black moved rook to e3. Turn off the tape again and decide on your plan as white. White will not oblige by exchanging rooks, nor should he play pawn to f6 when black plays rook takes f3, white, knight takes f3, black pawn to d3, white pawn to f7, and black plays bishop to g7, threatening to support his own pawn's advance while stopping white's pawn. Instead, from diagram 8a, if you'll reset the pieces, white gains an important tempo by playing rook to f4, pinning the black passed pawn, and black moves king to b5. To go to c3 would hardly be thematic, as it would further obstruct the bishop that he's so frantically trying to get into play. If you had not decided on your line for white here, switch off and have another look at the position. The main moves here seem to be knight to d3 and pawn to f6. Pawn to f6 is most straightforward, and we will try this. And we answer black pawn to d3 by white knight to c4. But instead of pawn to d3, black would have played rook takes knight check, king takes rook, pawn to d3 discovering check, king to e6, pawn to d2, rook to f1. Black now plays bishop takes f6, white plays king takes f6, and black plays king to c4 when he can draw. Please return to diagram 8b. White knight to d3 is another try. Black can play rook takes knight, and white can play pawn to f6. Black plays rook to c3, white plays pawn to f7, black plays rook to c8, white queens the pawn, black takes the queen, white takes black's rook, and black plays pawn to d3. White can stop this pawn by rook to b8 check, king to a5, white king to c5, black king to a6, white rook to d8. But the position once again looks drawn. Instead of these two possibilities, go back to diagram 8b and reset the position. White found the brilliant resource, white knight to c6. There is a mating net to be woven should black advance p to d3 by rook to b4 check, king to a6 and white king to c5. And black must cede material to avoid mate at b6. So black's answer to knight to c6 from diagram 8b was rook to e2. One idea was that if white were to capture the pawn on d4, black would exchange pieces and win white's pawn on a2. And the other was to advance the pawn on d4 to d3, breaking the prescribed mating net, because he can check by rook on the c-file. Anyway, it is up to you again. Switch off the tape and decide upon your play as white after black has played rook to e2. White has a forced win here after all, arising from a little thing called interference, i.e. white pawn to f6, black pawn to d3, white pawn to f7, black pawn to d2, white rook to b4 check, black king to a6, white king to c5. And here is the interference. Black's rook can no longer check on the c-file. The end could be black rook to e5 check, white knight takes e5. Black pawn to d1 equals q, white rook to b6 check. Black king to a7, white knight to c6 check. Black king to a8, white to r b8 mate. This fine finish is worthy of an endgame study. White combined various motives, blocking the enemy bishop, advancing his passed pawn, mating attacks with the knight, in exquisite manner. Please set up position 9. This was a game between Alekhine White and Wiedmar Hastings, 1936-7. It is White's move, and you can examine the position to see what you think he should do. With a wide front, as here, it is usually easier to win with the bishop. And the narrower the front, the better the knight. One must bear in mind, however, that if you have a bad bishop, your opponent may get drawing chances. Here, White's extra pawn is blockaded and even in some danger. First, he must stabilize the position. That is, get his rook better placed, secure his pawn. Another objective, which occurs in any kind of ending, is to find some points of attack on the other side of the board, here the king's side. White need not fear a few pawn exchanges. These will open lines for his bishop in the future. A word on what we mean by stabilizing. When there is one piece each in the ending, it is often difficult to reach a calm position, and you can settle down to some careful maneuvering. In the kind of ending with which we are dealing, however, it is often possible to arrive at such a calm position and then find ways of working out a win. Were it black to move, in the position of diagram 9, he could stir up trouble by rook to b6. And after white plays bishop to f3, black plays knight to a6. And now, if white plays pawn to b5, black can play rook takes b5, and if white takes the knight, he will be checkmated on the back rank. However, from diagram 9, it is white to move, and he scotches his threat with pawn to g4, giving his king a flight square, as well as providing a square for the bishop at e4, without fearing the reply by black, pawn to f5. After pawn to g4, black played king to e7, and white played pawn to b5. This does not in fact lose a pawn, since after knight takes b5, white can pin the knight by rook to b4. This type of maneuver frequently occurs in rook and minor piece endings. The effectiveness of the pin depends on whether the pinned piece can move away and yet defend the piece behind it. Had white's rook been on b3 and the black knight on b4, you can see that the knight could easily move away to a6 or c6, at the same time guarding the rook at b8. But in the present situation, this is impossible. If you'll glance back to diagram 9 for a minute, I'd like you to decide whether white could have played pb5 on the previous move. And I'll leave this for you to look at. The answer is he could, because if knight takes p from diagram 9, after you've played the pawn to b5, white plays rook to b4 and black plays rook to c8. And this fails against bishop takes b5. There is no mate on the back rank by rook to c1 because white can answer bishop to f1. So much for analysis. Now let us return to the game. In the position of diagram 9, after the moves white pawn to g4, black king to e7, white pawn to b5, black played pawn to e5. Presumably he wished to play his king to d6 without allowing white to check with the rook. And the next moves were white pawn to f4, black pawn to f6, white pawn takes e5, black pawn takes e5, white rook to a2, planning in a general way to bring the rook to the d file and then up to d7. Black answered rook to b6, getting ready to capture the pawn at b5. White defended with rook to b2. Then black played pawn to h6, white played king to f2, black played king to e6, and white played king to f3. White intends to derive some benefit from the square he has provided for himself at e4. You will note that black is beginning to run out of moves. His rook at b6 is especially passive. He decided to play knight to d5. Switch off here and decide how you will continue as white. There is quite a choice of moves for white in this position. Only pawn to e4, which puts a pawn on the same colour square as his bishop, would be a bad move. It would also block the way through for his king. White could consider going into the rook ending by bishop takes knight check, or by the maneuver rook to d2, knight to c7, rook to d7, knight takes b5, white plays bishop takes b5, black plays rook takes b5, and white plays rook takes g7. Here, though white has won a pawn, the ending is not that easy for white to win, because black's king is stationed on the king's side in a good defensive position. In fact, one would expect such an endgame to be drawn when all the pawns are on one side of the board. Please return to diagram 9a. White's choice of move in this position was pawn to h4, an expanding and awaiting move. And now you want to know what I mean by expanding. I will say something about this. Black's pieces are passive. In such a situation, it often pays to advance one's pawns as far as possible. They're not likely to be weak, and the defender's pieces are passive and cannot get at them. By expanding move, we mean a move that sort of gains ground across the board. Sooner or later, when pieces are exchanged, this may lead to a one ending of a simpler sort, which would not be one if the pawns were not so far forward. In this particular case, White also wants to move a pawn to g5 to prevent knight checking on this square, to make it safe for him to advance his king to e4. After White, going back to diagram 9a, and after White had played pawn to h4, Black answered knight to e7. White played bishop to e4. Black played knight to d5. White played rook to b3. Black played king to d6. White played pawn to g5. And Black played h-pawn takes pawn at g5, and White recaptured h-pawn takes pawn at g5. Now White's pawn on this square makes it possible to consider the advance of his king without fear of the knight checking, as we said before. Now Black played king to e6, White played bishop to d3, and Black played king to d6. And White played rook to a3. This is the kind of maneuvering, we were saying, you could make in a stable position. White is probing. He wants to try and find a way for his rook to get into the enemy ranks on the 7th or 8th rank, in fact. But it can't be done this way, as we shall see. Black plays knight to c7, and White plays rook to a7. Please switch off and study this position for a while. White is offering the b-pawn, but after Black plays knight takes b5 and White plays rook takes g7, the g-pawn, now a passed pawn, will be hard to stop. So, instead of this, Black marked time from diagram 9b with rook to b8, and White now had to look for some other way of penetrating with his rook. He played White king to e4, threatening to move it further forward, and Black replied pawn to g6 to prevent this. This must have been a hard decision for Black. Now both his pawns, the one at e5 and the one at g6, seem vulnerable to attack. However, he is threatening rook to b6 and knight takes b5. Hence, White played rook to a3, planning to exchange into a winning king and pawn endgame by means of rook to b3 should Black capture the pawn with his knight. After White had played rook to a3, Black moved rook to b6, and White played bishop to c4, and Black rook to b8. How would you now play as White? White finally discovered a way of penetrating into Black's position with rook to d3 check. Black played king to c5, and White played rook to d7. If Black were now to take the bishop, White would capture the knight with check. Black could then capture the pawn with his king at b5. But there is a great difference between the rook and pawn ending that here comes about and the one we looked at previously. black's king is cut off on the queen's side, and white will have very little difficulty in winning. If you are unsure of the winning process, then the cassette on rook and pawn endings will prove helpful here. Let us return to the position of diagram 9C. Black could not accept the above line and played knight from c7 to e8, still threatening both to take the bishop with his king and perhaps to check with his knight at d6. White moved not bishop to d3, which would allow this check, but bishop to f7. After knight to d6 check, white played king takes e5, and black played rook to b6. Turn off your cassette again and choose white's move. White was in no hurry to capture the g-pawn. Quite rightly, in view of black's answer, knight c4 check. He is content that black's king has been driven from its defensive post on the king's side. Perhaps driven is the wrong word. Lured by the b-pawn might be better. White moved pawn to e4. This puts black into a kind of zugzwang. He at last has to capture the b-pawn with his knight, allowing white to push his king yet further away. So, black knight takes pawn at b5. White rook to d5 check. Black king to b4. White rook to d8. Black knight to a7. A desperate throw, perhaps hoping to fork with his knight at c6. White moved rook to d6, and black is finished. His last pawn must fall, and he can't stop white's passed pawns. The remaining moves, if you would like to be in at the death, can be found in the booklet. This is an instructive ending, particularly so the position after rook to d6, when all black's pieces, except of course the g-pawn, find themselves on the far side of the board on the a and b files, whilst white's pieces are in the centre and on the king's side. Please set up position 10. This is from the 21st World Championship game between Korchnoi, White and Karpov in 1978. It is White's move, and you may wish to look at this position for a little while. Play takes place over a wide front. The extra pawn is an outside passed pawn accompanied by a knight. Such endings are less likely to be won than if the passed pawn were accompanied by a bishop. In this example, white's passed pawn is on the 7th and guarded by a knight on a central square. But the knight is not anchored there. That is to say, it's not guarded by a white pawn. White begins with what I call a pendulum maneuver, which commonly occurs in this type of endgame. The rook moves across a rank and back again, sometimes coming back to a different square. What is the purpose of such a maneuver? Usually it is a way of holding the enemy king from approaching the scene of action too quickly, or delaying the king's approach. Very often the rook can gain a tempo by returning to a different square on the rank. Sometimes the pendulum may be used merely to gain time on the clock. Very practical consideration. And to begin this movement, white plays rook to g8, and black plays bishop to e5. If black had moved his king to f7, white would have played his rook to d8, attacking the bishop. And then, if black moves the king back, he would check at d7 with his rook. However, after black has played bishop to e5, white played pawn to f4. This is the only way he can make progress, because there is no way the rook and knight together can force the pawn to queen. White now brings his king into the game and tries to open up the king's side. Black moved pawn takes pawn en passant check, and white played king takes pawn. Black played king to f7. White moved rook to c8, completing the pendulum. Now, even if black plays bishop to d6 and rook to b5, he will still not be threatening to capture white's knight, because, of course, of the strength of the pawn on the 7th. Black moved instead king to e7, and white played pawn to h3. And black played pawn to h5. This is a mistake, because the h-pawn is not guarded, and it becomes vulnerable. As in the previous Korchnoi-Karpov ending, Karpov acts from a desire to exchange off as many pawns as possible, and perhaps sacrifice his minor piece for the remaining pawn. This, of course, is no bad plan, in principle. However, better than pawn to h5 here would have been rook to b5, keeping the knight under attack. After this, the game should be drawn, because white will find it almost impossible to make any progress. But switch off now and study the position. White played rook to g8, the beginning of a decisive pendulum maneuver. For the moment, he's threatening knight to d3. Black moved k to f7, and white played rook to d8, completing the pendulum. This is the position of diagram 10a. Please switch off and study it for a time. Here are two variations to show what would happen if black now moves his king back to e7. Black king to e7, white rook to d7 check, black king to e8, white rook to d5, and the bishop's rather short of squares and retreats to b8. White plays rook takes f5, black plays bishop to d6, and white plays rook takes h5, black plays bishop takes knight at c5, and white plays rook takes knight at c5, with a winning rook and pawn ending. Return the pieces again to diagram 10a. Now another line. If black plays king to e7, and white plays rook to d7 check, and black plays d7 check, k to f6, white plays rook to d5. He threatens a combination by rook takes bishop, knight to d7 check, and then queening the pawn. So black moves bishop to c7. Now he plays knight to a6, black plays rook takes b7, and white plays rook to d7, winning a piece. Through the pin motive, that we've seen before. Return then once again to diagram 10A, if you would please. We'll see what happened in the game. Black played pawn to g5, and white played pawn to g4. This is necessary, of course, because black was threatening to check with his g-pawn. Black played h-pawn takes g-pawn check, and white played h-pawn takes g-pawn, and black played king to e7, and white played rook to g8. Another pendulum movement begins. And black took the pawn on g4 with check, and white took pawn on g4 with his king. Black played king to f7, and now the rook returns, white rook returns to c8, and black played bishop to d6. Turn off the tape and study this position with white to move. White played pawn to e4. Black played rook to g1, check. White played king to f5. Black played pawn to g4, and white played pawn to e5. Black played rook to f1 check. Black played king to e4. Black played rook to e1 check. White now finished off with king to d5. Black now saw he couldn't take the king's pawn with the bishop because white would answer knight d3. So instead he played rook to d1 check. White played knight to d3 just the same, and a pretty finish followed when black played rook takes d3 check, and white played king to c4. Black now must lose both his pieces, so he resigned. The finish might be black bishop takes e5, white king takes d3, black pawn to g3, white pawn equals queen, black bishop takes queen, white rook takes bishop, black pawn to g2, white rook to b1. White is just in time to stop the pawn. For the ordinary player, such endings are remarkable when one side is enabled to win despite there being so few pawns on the board. And the win with an outside pass pawn and knight is a fairly precarious affair, as we see here. It often requires great tactical skill for success. Curiously, better winning chances are offered when the extra pawn is not isolated, or even passed. The play usually takes a different pattern, of a more stable, less tactical kind of quiet maneuvering. One of the long-term ideas is gradually to force the player with the bishop to place his pawns on squares of the same color as those used by the bishop.
For a demonstration of this theme, please turn to example 11 in the booklet and analyze it independently. Example 12, also in the booklet, winds up the set with a fascinating display from the archpriest of these endgames, Emanuel Lasker. Meanwhile, I hope you've enjoyed listening to this tape, and I think you will agree with me that it opens up a whole new world of chess ideas to the average player. Thank you, and goodbye.